Imagine soaring miles above the earth, cocooned in the ultimate luxury of a private jet. Gleaming wood, plush leather, an oasis of calm. But for one passenger, Isabella Sinclair, this flight becomes anything but serene. The lead flight attendant, Caroline Ashton, fueled by prejudice and misplaced authority, has already subjected her to dismissive treatment. Now, after a deliberately spilled tray of ice water and false accusations, the confrontation reaches its boiling point. Isabella, calm despite the water soaking her clothes, looks up at the furious attendant and says quietly, "If treating every passenger with respect is too much to ask, then perhaps you are the one who doesn't belong here." The air crackles. Caroline Ashton leans in, her face a mask of rage, her voice a venomous hiss right before she completely loses control. "How dare you speak to me like that?" She has no idea who she's truly confronting. She's unaware that the passenger she's about to assault isn't just anyone. She's the billionaire who owns the very plane they're standing in. What happens when unchecked arrogance meets unimaginable power? What terrifying mistake has this attendant just made? If you were shocked by that moment and need to see how this unfolds, like this video right now, what would you have done in Isabella's shoes? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this incredible story of justice and consequence. You won't believe what happens next. The air inside the Gulfstream G650 hummed with a low, almost imperceptible thrum, the sound of powerful engines held in perfect check. It was less a noise, more a vibration felt deep in the plush, cream-colored leather seats. Sunlight streamed through the oversized oval windows, catching the subtle gold threads woven into the bulkhead panels and reflecting off the polished burr walnut tables. The scent in the cabin was a quiet blend of expensive leather, fresh orchids arranged in discreet crystal vases, and perhaps the faintest trace of jet fuel, a reminder of the effortless power currently defying gravity miles above the earth. This was a world designed for ultimate comfort, ultimate exclusivity. A gilded cage soaring through the stratosphere. Isabella Sinclair settled into her seat, the leather sighing softly beneath her. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and matching slacks, she exuded an understated elegance that spoke more of quiet confidence than overt wealth. Her gaze swept the cabin briefly, taking in the luxurious details, not with awe, but with a familiar, appraising eye. This wasn't just another trip. It was a necessary journey, a flight across time zones to oversee a crucial expansion in her ever-growing empire. For now, though, she preferred anonymity. It was simpler, less complicated. Sometimes the weight of the Sinclair name felt heavier than the responsibilities it entailed. She opened her briefcase, retrieving a slim tablet, its screen immediately lighting up with complex market projections. Near the main entrance, Caroline Ashton, the lead flight attendant, stood poised. Her uniform was immaculate, tailored to perfection, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe but flawless chignon. Sharp features and an air of crisp control defined her presence. She greeted the arriving passengers, her smile adjusting its wattage depending on the entrant. "Mr. and Mrs. Raymond, how wonderful to have you with us again," Caroline purred, her voice warm honey, as the elderly couple boarded. Mrs. Raymond clutched a small knitting bag, her fingers already twitching, while Mr. Raymond, carrying a folded newspaper, offered a polite nod. Caroline's attention lingered on them, ensuring their comfort with practiced ease. "Can I get you anything before we take off? Champagne, perhaps?" Mr. Raymond gestured towards his pre-poured coffee, satisfied. Mrs. Raymond shook her head politely, already absorbed in her yarn. Caroline's smile remained bright, professional. Then Isabella stepped fully into the cabin. Caroline Ashton's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened, losing its genuine warmth. The honeyed tone acquired a fraction of frost. "Welcome aboard," she said. The words clipped, professional, yet distinctly cooler than the greeting offered to the Raymonds just moments before. Her eyes flickered over Isabella's simple, elegant attire, then briefly down to her carry-on bag. It was a micro-assessment, swift and clinical, and Isabella felt it like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. There it is, Isabella thought, a familiar weariness settling briefly in her chest before she consciously pushed it away. The slight chill, the subtle recalibration in tone, the fleeting assessment based on… what? Skin color. The quiet way she carried herself. It was an old, unwelcome acquaintance, this silent judgment, and it never failed to surprise her how it could find its way even into the rarefied air of a multi-million-dollar private jet. Her jet. She offered a polite, neutral nod in return. Thank you. Isabella moved towards her assigned seat, window side, near the front of the main cabin section. As she settled, arranging her tablet and a bottle of water she'd brought on board, she noticed other passengers. Across the aisle sat a man in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a business suit, emanating a calm, observant energy. David Miller, she recalled vaguely from the passenger manifest. Further back, a woman with brightly coiffed hair and an air of entitlement was already engaged in an animated phone call, her voice a shade too loud for the serene environment. The requisite socialite, perhaps. Hannah Evans, the junior flight attendant, moved through the cabin with a quieter, less imposing energy than her superior. She offered a warm, genuine smile to Isabella as she passed, checking if she needed assistance with her bag. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" Hannah asked, her voice soft. "Perfectly fine, thank you, Hannah," Isabella replied, returning the smile. The contrast between the two attendants was stark. Caroline, meanwhile, continued her duties, her movements precise, almost militaristic. She checked on the Raymonds again, offered another beaming smile. She adjusted a cushion for the socialite, listening patiently to a snippet of the loud conversation. She exchanged a pleasant word with David Miller. But as she moved past Isabella's seat, her gaze slid over her as if she were part of the upholstery. No offer of a drink, no check for comfort. It wasn't overt rudeness, it was something more insidious. A deliberate lack of acknowledgement, a subtle erasure. An invisible wall being erected. Isabella focused on her tablet, refusing to let the slight sting. She'd dealt with far worse, built an empire against headwinds stronger than a flight attendant's disapproval. Yet a part of her still felt the weary disappointment. This aircraft, this airline, they were hers, built on principles of excellence, service, and respect. And here, within its very walls, that principle was being subtly, yet unmistakably violated. She needed to finalize the presentation points for the Singapore meeting. She drew a breath, centering herself, pushing the interaction to the back of her mind. It wasn't the time. A short while later, Caroline began the pre-flight service, gliding down the aisle with a tray of champagne flutes and sparkling water. She served the Raymonds first, then Mr. Miller, engaging in brief, pleasant conversation with each. She bypassed Isabella's row entirely, heading towards the passengers seated further back. Isabella watched her progress in the reflection on her dark tablet screen. It was intentional. There was no doubt now. The earlier chill hadn't been imagination. It was a calculated cold shoulder. When Caroline eventually made her way back up the aisle, the tray significantly lighter, Isabella kept her voice even, polite. "Excuse me," she said, catching Caroline's eye as she passed. "Could I have some water, please?" Caroline paused, her body angled slightly away, as if reluctant to fully engage. She glanced at Isabella, then at the remaining glasses on her tray, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll get to you when I can," she replied curtly. The tone wasn't just dismissive, it bordered on insolent. And then she simply walked away, moving towards the galley without another word, leaving Isabella in a pool of stunned silence, momentarily broken only by the soft hum of the engines preparing for takeoff. Isabella leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady, watching the retreating figure of the flight attendant. The invisible wall had just become a little more solid, a little colder, and the smooth, luxurious flight ahead suddenly felt like it might encounter some unexpected turbulence. She looked out the window as the plane began its powerful taxi towards the runway. The gilded cage felt, for the first time that day, distinctly like a cage. The Gulfstream's powerful engines shifted from a deep thrum to a rising, undeniable roar as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Isabella Sinclair felt the familiar pressure pinning her gently back into the plush leather seat. Outside the window, the ground blurred into streaks of grey and green, then fell away with deceptive grace. They were airborne, climbing steeply into the vast, indifferent blue. The tension from the brief cold interaction with Caroline Ashton still lingered, a faint static charge in the otherwise serene cabin. Isabella focused on the ascent, the subtle shifts of the plane beneath her, a physical reality far more tangible than the flight attendant's unspoken hostility. For a few minutes, an illusion of normalcy settled over the cabin. The socialite resumed her phone call, though perhaps at a slightly lower volume. Mrs. Raymond's knitting needles clicked softly, a comforting rhythmic sound. Mr. Raymond had unfolded his newspaper. Across the aisle, David Miller typed intently on his laptop, though Isabella noticed his gaze occasionally flickered towards the front galley, a thoughtful crease between his brows. Hannah Evans moved quietly, collecting the champagne flutes with a practiced, almost invisible efficiency, offering Isabella a brief, hesitant smile as she passed. The piece, however, was fragile, thin as the air outside. Moments later, Caroline Ashton emerged from the galley. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression composed, but carrying a distinct edge, like polished steel. She wasn't carrying a water bottle for Isabella. Instead, she walked with brisk, purposeful strides directly back to Isabella's seat, stopping beside it, forcing Isabella to look up from her tablet. "Excuse me, ma'am," Caroline began again. Her voice was pitched low, professionally modulated, yet somehow it carried through the quiet cabin. There was a sweetness in it now, brittle and false. "I need to address something with you." Isabella met her gaze evenly, waiting. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding your seating," Caroline continued, her smile tight, unwavering. "As I mentioned implicitly before, this forward section of the cabin is reserved for our elite-tier passengers, our primary charter clients." The emphasis on elite was subtle but unmistakable. Isabella felt a slow, cold knot form in her stomach. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a profound weariness mixed with a familiar resolve. She kept her voice level, calm. "There's no misunderstanding, Ms. Ashton. Seat 2A is my assigned seat, according to my booking." Caroline's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "Perhaps there was a system error," she suggested, the implication clear. The error wasn't the systems, it was Isabella's presence. Sometimes these things happen. The rear cabin is also quite comfortable, I assure you. If you'd just— "Why don't you verify the passenger manifest, Ms. Ashton?" Isabella interjected softly, yet cutting through Caroline's condescending tone. "That should clarify things definitively." The suggestion hung in the air. It was reasonable, logical, standard procedure. Caroline's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly. A flicker of irritation crossed her features before being smoothed away. "That won't be necessary," she said sharply, abandoning the pretense of politeness. "I am intimately familiar with our regular clientele and seating arrangements on this aircraft. I know who belongs here." The last three words were delivered with pointed significance. The invisible wall Isabella had felt earlier was now solidifying, becoming a tangible barrier erected by prejudice. The quiet hum of the engines seemed to fade as the tension in the immediate vicinity crackled. Across the aisle, David Miller had stopped typing. His frown deepened, his gaze fixed on the interaction. Mrs. Raymond paused her knitting, exchanging an uneasy look with her husband, who lowered his newspaper slowly. The socialite further back abruptly ended her call, her eyes wide with avid curiosity, leaning forward slightly. Even two other passengers, a middle-aged couple seated behind the Raymonds who had seemed engrossed in conversation, now fell silent, their attention drawn to the unfolding confrontation. One of them shifted, pointedly turning to stare out the window, a classic display of wanting no part in the awkwardness. Hannah Evans hovered near the galley entrance, wringing her hands almost imperceptibly, her face pale with distress. She looked like she wanted to speak, perhaps to retrieve the manifest Isabella had suggested, but a quick, sharp glance from Caroline froze her in place. "Ms. Ashton," Isabella said, her voice still quiet but gaining an edge of steel. "I believe airline policy dictates respect for all confirmed seating assignments, regardless of how familiar you believe you are with the clientele. Would you agree?" Caroline's lips thinned into a white line, being challenged, especially on policy, by someone she had already mentally dismissed, clearly rankled. "The policy also dictates a harmonious environment for all passengers," she retorted, her voice rising slightly, loud enough now for everyone nearby to hear clearly. And your insistence on remaining in a seat, clearly not meant for you, is becoming disruptive. Disruptive. The accusation was absurd. Isabella hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene. She had merely stated facts and requested verification. The disruption was entirely of Caroline's making, fueled by baseless assumptions. I am not moving from my assigned seat, Isabella stated simply. There was no anger in her voice, only finality. If you feel the need to escalate this, that is your prerogative. But I suggest you reconsider. For a moment, Caroline seemed taken aback by the unwavering refusal, the quiet authority that seemed utterly at odds with the assumptions she had made. She glanced around, perhaps sensing the discomfort, the shifting attention of the other passengers. David Miller shifted in his seat, looking as though he might intervene. Just then, the soft chime indicating the seatbelt sign had been turned off sounded through the cabin, followed by the pilot's calm voice over the intercom announcing their cruising altitude and expected flight time. The routine announcement momentarily broke the charged atmosphere around Isabella's seat. Caroline visibly straightened her already perfect uniform jacket, taking a sharp breath. She seemed to make a decision. Escalating further, right now, with everyone watching, might be imprudent. She needed control, and she had momentarily lost it. She gave Isabella one last look, a look that held frustration, contempt, and a clear promise of unfinished business. We will address this seating issue properly, she muttered, her voice low and tight with resentment, before turning on her heel and striding stiffly back towards the galley. The immediate confrontation was over, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Isabella watched her go, the invisible wall between them now feeling less like glass and more like reinforced concrete. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the cabin's warmth, that this was far from over. Caroline Ashton wouldn't let it rest. The flight stretched ahead, long and suddenly arduous. Isabella picked up her tablet again, but the numbers on the screen seemed to blur. The gilded cage had just shown its bars. The Gulf Stream settled into its cruising altitude, a serene silver dart against the endless canvas of the sky. Below, clouds drifted like islands in a pale blue ocean. Inside, the initial tension following the seat confrontation had seemingly smoothed over, replaced by the quiet rhythm of a long flight. Mr. Raymond rustled his newspaper. Mrs. Raymond's knitting needles resumed their soft clicking mantra. David Miller appeared absorbed in his work, the keyboard tapping softly. Yet an invisible current remained, a shared awareness, a subtle holding of breath among those who had witnessed the earlier exchange. Isabella Sinclair tried to immerse herself in the quarterly reports displayed on her tablet, but the chill from Caroline Ashton's final glare lingered. She still needed water. She waited patiently, observing the lead flight attendant from the corner of her eye. Caroline moved through the cabin, performing her duties with a rigid efficiency. She offered refills, cleared away coffee cups, her professional mask firmly back in place, yet she consistently managed to avoid making eye contact with Isabella or acknowledging her section of the cabin. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, a deliberate silent reinforcement of the earlier conflict. After nearly 20 minutes, as Caroline passed nearby attending to Mr. Miller, Isabella spoke again, her voice calm and low, careful not to draw undue attention. Ms. Ashton, when you have a moment, I would still appreciate a glass of water. Caroline stopped, turning slowly. The professional mask flickered, revealing a flash of annoyance before being smoothed over. Of course, she said, her tone clipped. She pivoted and walked towards the galley without further comment. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a single glass of sparkling water on a small polished tray. Her movements were precise, almost stiff. She approached Isabella's seat, her expression unreadable but lacking any warmth. As Caroline drew level, Isabella, seeking a slightly more comfortable position for the long flight, shifted slightly in her seat, stretching one leg almost imperceptibly into the aisle space beside her, a common unconscious adjustment made by travelers everywhere. It was a minor movement, unassuming, easily accommodated. But Caroline, instead of maintaining her direct path to hand over the water, altered her trajectory ever so slightly. It was a fractional adjustment, perhaps only an inch or two inward, but it was enough. Her polished black heel struck Isabella's outstretched ankle, not hard enough to cause serious pain, but enough to jolt. In that instant, Caroline gasped, a sharp, theatrical sound. The tray tilted violently, the glass of sparkling water tumbled forward, ice cubes scattering, the cold liquid splashing directly onto Isabella's navy slacks and pooling onto the plush cream-colored carpet below. Silence descended instantly, absolute and heavy, broken only by the faint fizzing sound of the spilled water soaking into the fabric. Every head in the forward cabin snapped towards the commotion. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Caroline exclaimed loudly, her voice sharp with accusation, stepping back dramatically as if she were the victim of an assault. "Watch where you're putting your legs. You've made me spill everything. Now look at this mess." She gestured angrily at the spreading wet patch on the carpet, then glared at Isabella's damp trousers. Isabella looked up, startled by the sudden cold splash and the immediate venomous accusation. She instinctively brushed at the water on her slacks, the fabric cold against her skin. The injustice of the situation, the deliberate nature of the accident, the instant blame, sent a hot surge through her, quickly banked by years of practiced control. "But you walked into my leg, Ms. Ashton," Isabella stated, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through Caroline's theatrical outburst. It was a simple statement of fact. Caroline's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. She placed her hands on her hips, ignoring Isabella's factual correction entirely. "This is precisely what I mean," she declared, her voice rising, clearly intending for the other passengers to hear. "Complete lack of awareness. Some people simply aren't suited for this type of travel, causing disturbances, making messes." She let the sentence hang, laden with insinuation. The public humiliation was blatant now. Isabella could feel the weight of multiple pairs of eyes fixed on her, curious, pitying, judgmental. David Miller looked distinctly uncomfortable, his hand hovering near his call button. Mrs. Raymond had stopped knitting altogether, her eyes wide with dismay. The socialite watched with undisguised fascination. Hannah Evans, standing near the galley again, looked horrified, her hand covering her mouth. This calculated act, the deliberate spill followed by the false accusation, was an escalation Isabella couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about a seat anymore, or a glass of water. It was about dignity. "Ms. Ashton," Isabella said, her voice low but gaining a resonance that made Caroline pause her tirade. "This behavior is unprofessional and entirely unacceptable. I have done nothing to warrant this treatment." She met Caroline's furious gaze directly. "I have only asked for the basic courtesy and service afforded to every passenger on this aircraft." She paused, letting the words sink in, then added, her voice dropping slightly but carrying even more weight. "If treating every passenger with respect is too much to ask, then perhaps you are the one who doesn't belong here." The challenge was direct, unmistakable. It struck at the core of Caroline's assumed authority, her prejudiced world-view. For a moment, Caroline seemed speechless, her mouth opening and closing slightly. The color drained from her face, only to rush back with even greater intensity. Her carefully constructed composure finally shattered. She took a step closer, leaning down towards Isabella, invading her personal space. Her knuckles were white where she clenched her fists at her sides. The air crackled with her fury. "How dare you!" Caroline hissed, her voice trembling with rage, spittle flying from her lips. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Her eyes blazed, twin points of ice and fire. Her hand twitched at her side, balling into a fist, then unclenching, then balling up again. The boiling point had been reached. The eruption was imminent. "How dare you!" Caroline Ashton's voice was a low, venomous hiss, vibrating with unrestrained fury. She leaned closer still, her face contorted, the carefully applied makeup, doing little to conceal the raw ugliness of her prejudice, now laid bare. The air around them seemed to thin, charged with an electric tension that silenced even the ever-present hum of the Gulfstream's engines. Passengers held their breath, eyes wide, locked onto the unfolding drama. Isabella Sinclair remained seated, her posture outwardly relaxed, yet every line of her body radiated a quiet, unyielding defiance. For a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen. Caroline's chest heaved, her eyes blazing into Isabella's calm, steady gaze. The mask of professionalism had not just slipped, it had shattered, leaving behind something raw and uncontrolled. And then it happened. With a sharp, explosive movement fueled by pure rage and wounded pride, Caroline raised her right hand. The motion was shockingly fast, cutting through the tense stillness. Before anyone could react, before David Miller could fully rise from his seat, before Hannah Evans could utter a protest, Caroline's open palm connected sharply with Isabella Sinclair's left cheek. Crack. The sound was horrifyingly loud in the enclosed space, not a dull thud, but a sharp, distinct report that echoed off the polished walnut and silenced the very air. It was the sound of a line being irrevocably crossed, a violation so blatant, so unexpected in this environment of curated luxury that it seemed to suck the oxygen from the cabin. Absolute silence followed for a stretched second, a heavy, stunned vacuum where even breathing felt like an intrusion. Caroline stood frozen for that instant, her hand still slightly raised, her own eyes wide now, perhaps reflecting a dawning horror at her own loss of control, or perhaps just the raw adrenaline dump after the act. Then the reactions rippled outwards like waves from a stone dropped into a still pond. Gasps, sharp, audible intakes of breath from multiple passengers. Mrs. Raymond let out a small, choked cry, her hand flying to her chest as she clutched her husband's arm tightly. Mr. Raymond's face was thunderous, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrest. David Miller, halfway out of his seat, froze mid-motion, his expression a mixture of disbelief and outright anger. "Hey, that's enough," he finally managed, his voice tight. The socialite's jaw had dropped, her previous fascination replaced by wide-eyed shock. Even the passengers who had tried to ignore the earlier tension were now staring openly, their faces registering various degrees of horror and disbelief. Near the galley, Hannah Evans gasped audibly, tears instantly springing to her eyes as her hands flew to cover her mouth. She looked utterly devastated. Isabella Sinclair didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. Her head snapped back slightly from the force of the blow, a testament to its surprising strength. For a fraction of a second, a burning heat flared across her cheek, a physical manifestation of the insult. Deep within, beneath the layers of practiced composure, a flash of raw, unadulterated anger surged, hot and fierce, followed by the cold, familiar sting of humiliation. Her own hand started an involuntary journey towards her stinging cheek, a purely human reflex, but stopped halfway, her fingers curling slightly before falling back to her lap. It took a visible, conscious effort, a tightening around her mouth, a subtle squaring of her shoulders to regain complete control. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened in her seat. She didn't touch her face. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her head, meeting Caroline Ashton's wide, slightly panicked eyes. Isabella's gaze was unnervingly calm now, but the quiet weariness from before was gone, replaced by something hard, cold, and intensely focused. It was the look of a decision made, a line crossed not by her, but for her. Her breathing remained steady even. When she finally spoke, her voice was unnaturally quiet, yet it sliced through the thick silence of the cabin like a shard of ice. Each word was enunciated with chilling precision. "You just made," she paused, the silence stretching, amplifying the weight of her words, "the biggest mistake of your professional life." The statement wasn't loud. It wasn't overtly threatening, but delivered with such absolute frigid calm in the aftermath of a physical assault, it carried an authority, a finality, that was far more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been. Caroline seemed to shrink back slightly, the residual fury in her eyes flickering, replaced by the first nascent seeds of fear, of confusion. What was this reaction? Why wasn't this woman screaming, crying, fighting back? Isabella didn't wait for a response. With movements that were measured and economical, entirely devoid of agitation, she reached for the sleek smartphone resting on the armrest beside her. Her fingers, steady and sure, unlocked the screen. They moved quickly, tapping out a short, decisive message. Her thumb hovered over the send icon for a beat, then pressed down firmly. Done. She placed the phone back down on the armrest with a soft click that seemed, in the profound quiet, almost as loud as the slap had been. She looked back up, her gaze locking once more with Caroline's, her expression unreadable but absolute. The air vibrated with unspoken consequence. The message was sent, the signal was out. The quiet woman in Seat 2A had reacted, not with reciprocal violence, but with something far more potent. Caroline Ashton stood rooted to the spot, the color draining from her face now, a dawning, terrible realization beginning to creep into her eyes. What had she done? And more importantly, what was going to happen now? The silence stretched, thick with dread. The silence that followed Isabella Sinclair's quiet message was heavier, thicker than the stunned quiet after the slap itself. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken questions, vibrating with a dreadful anticipation. Caroline Ashton remained frozen near Isabella's seat, the earlier rage in her eyes now replaced by a dawning confusion, morphing rapidly into something that looked alarmingly like fear. The absolute unnerving calm of the woman she had just assaulted was profoundly unsettling. It wasn't the reaction of someone powerless. It wasn't the reaction of someone who belonged in the neat little box Caroline had mentally assigned her. What had that message contained? Who had she contacted? Around the cabin, the initial shock had subsided into a low murmur of hushed whispers. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, leaning towards each other, speculating in hushed tones. "Did you see that? She just took it. Who is she?" Caroline completely lost it. "That attendant, the young one, looks terrified." Indeed, near the galley entrance, Hannah Evans was pale, her hands trembling visibly. She kept darting glances between Caroline, who seemed rooted to the spot in a daze of receding adrenaline and growing dread, and Isabella, who sat with an almost regal stillness, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the cabin window. Hannah felt sick. What she had witnessed was wrong, deeply wrong. It violated every rule of conduct, every tenet of basic human decency. Caroline's behavior had been appalling from the start, but the slap, that was assault. Pure and simple, fear warred with indignation within her. Fear of Caroline's notorious temper, fear of losing her job. But the image of Isabella's quiet dignity after being struck, the memory of Caroline's venomous words, it tipped the scales. Making a decision, Hannah slipped discreetly further back into the small galley alcove, momentarily out of Caroline's direct line of sight. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she pulled her personal smartphone from her apron pocket. Using the official channels felt too slow, too uncertain right now. With trembling thumbs, she quickly navigated to her contacts, finding a number she hoped she'd never have to use. The direct line for Sinclair Airlines Executive Flight Operations Rapid Response Team, a number provided only for dire emergencies. She pressed call, holding the phone tightly to her ear, her heart pounding against her ribs. It connected almost instantly. "Executive Ops," a calm, professional voice answered. "This is Flight Attendant Hannah Evans," she whispered urgently, keeping her voice barely audible above the engine hum filtering into the galley. "On Gulfstream G650, flight designation 7 Alpha Charlie. We have an emergency situation on board. A code red. Specify the nature of the emergency, Hannah." The voice remained calm but instantly alert. "Passenger assault," Hannah stammered, forcing the words out. "Lead attendant Caroline Ashton physically assaulted a passenger, Miss Isabella Sinclair, in seat 2A. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, a beat of stunned silence. "Confirming passenger name?" "Sinclair. Isabella Sinclair," Hannah repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "Seat 2A. "Understood, Hannah. Stand by. Maintain cabin security. The flight deck is being notified immediately. Do not engage further unless necessary for safety." The line clicked dead. Hannah leaned against the cool metal galley wall, taking a shaky breath. She'd done it. Whatever happened now, she'd done the right thing. She tucked her phone away, schooling her features into a semblance of professional calm, though her insides were still churning. Back in the main cabin, the tense standoff continued. Caroline had finally seemed to regain some semblance of movement, though she looked lost, uncertain. She made a feeble attempt to assert herself, turning vaguely towards the other passengers. "This is simply a misunderstanding," she began, her voice lacking its earlier force. She was being disruptive. I merely—" The words trailed off lamely as she saw the stony expressions and averted gazes around her. No one was buying it. David Miller was watching her with undisguised contempt. Suddenly, a distinct click echoed from the front of the plane, the sound of the cockpit door being unlocked and opened. Every head turned. Captain Evans, a seasoned pilot in his mid-50s, with a usually jovial demeanor, stepped into the cabin. But there was nothing jovial about him now. His face was pale beneath his tan, his jaw tight with visible stress. His professional gaze swept the cabin, taking in the scene. Caroline standing awkwardly, Isabella seated calmly, with a visible red mark beginning to bloom on her cheek, the other passengers watching intently. His eyes lingered for a fraction of a second longer on Isabella, a flicker of something. Recognition. Confirmation. Passing through them before he focused grimly on Caroline. He strode down the aisle with purposeful steps, stopping directly in front of the lead flight attendant. His voice was low, tight, professional, but vibrating with controlled urgency. "Caroline," he said, omitting any honorific, "I need you to step aside, immediately." Caroline blinked, seeming genuinely confused now, perhaps expecting the captain to back her up. "Excuse me, Captain?" she asked, folding her arms defensively. "I'm handling this situation. This passenger was—" "Step aside. Now," Captain Evans repeated, his voice harder, cutting her off decisively. He wasn't asking. Visibly taken aback by his tone, Caroline reluctantly moved a step sideways, looking bewildered and increasingly alarmed. What was going on? The captain took a deep breath, glancing briefly again at Isabella, then back at Caroline, his expression grim. "Caroline," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying immense weight in the tense cabin, "I just received an urgent communication from the highest level of Sinclair Airlines management." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Caroline's eyes widened slightly. "The owner," Captain Evans continued, the words seeming to cost him an effort, "the owner of Sinclair Airlines, the ultimate principal of this entire operation, is currently on board this aircraft." A collective gasp went through the cabin, much louder this time. Whispers erupted instantly. "The owner? Sinclair's owner?" Caroline stared at him, her face beginning to drain of all color. What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Captain Evans didn't look away from her, but he made a small definitive gesture towards the calm, composed woman seated in 2A, the woman whose face now bore the red imprint of Caroline's hand. "I'm saying," the captain stated, his voice flat, heavy with the magnitude of the revelation, "that she is right here." He locked eyes with Caroline, delivering the final devastating blow. "Miss Isabella Sinclair." The name dropped into the cabin like a bomb. Caroline Ashton stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her throat. Her face was now utterly ashen, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. "No," she breathed, the word barely audible. That can't be. It's impossible." David Miller let out a low whistle, nodding slowly to himself. "Knew it," he muttered softly. The socialite looked like she might faint. Mrs. Raymond gripped her husband's hand tighter. Relief washed over Hannah Evans' face in the galley doorway. Absolute silence fell once more, broken only by Caroline Ashton's ragged breathing and the quiet, undeniable hum of the engines carrying the owner of the airline towards an unscheduled reckoning. The world had just tilted on its axis, and Caroline Ashton was in freefall. The stunned silence following the revelation of Isabella Sinclair's identity stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy. Caroline Ashton stood pale and trembling, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the composed black woman she had assaulted with the powerful billionaire who owned the very air they breathed. The other passengers remained quiet, processing the incredible turn of events, their gazes shifting between the now terrified flight attendant and the woman who held her fate in her hands. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, the captain's voice, calm but carrying an official weight, came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Due to an unforeseen onboard situation requiring immediate attention, we will be making an unscheduled landing shortly. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. Cabin crew, Prepare for landing." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. An unscheduled landing, confusion mixed with the residual shock. David Miller caught Isabella's eye, raising a questioning eyebrow. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that this deviation was necessary, orchestrated. The powerful engines changed pitch as the Gulf Stream began its descent. Banking smoothly towards an airfield Isabella knew well, a private executive terminal equipped to handle situations like this with discretion and efficiency. Below, the patchwork landscape grew clearer, sharper. The landing was impeccably smooth, the aircraft touching down with barely a bump before taxiing briskly off the main runway towards a secluded hangar area. As the jet slowed to a halt, the cabin remained silent, all eyes watching the windows. Within moments, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows glided silently across the tarmac, pulling up directly beside the aircraft stairs, which lowered with a quiet hydraulic hiss. The SUV doors opened and two figures emerged, a man and a woman, both dressed in sharp, dark business attire. They moved with an air of quiet competence and authority, ascending the steps without hesitation. They entered the cabin, their professional gazes sweeping the scene quickly before landing on Isabella. The man stepped forward slightly. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice calm and respectful, ignoring everyone else. "We're here. Everything is prepared as you requested. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Michael," Isabella replied, her voice steady. And then, for the first time since the ordeal began, she moved to stand up. She rose gracefully from her seat, the movement fluid and deliberate. She smoothed her navy blazer, ignoring the damp patch still visible on her slacks. The red mark on her cheek was more pronounced now, a stark contrast to her composed demeanor. Every eye in the cabin followed her. The quiet authority she radiated was palpable, amplified now by the confirmation of her identity and the arrival of her team. She turned, her gaze locking onto Caroline Ashton, who flinched visibly, seeming to shrink under the weight of that calm scrutiny. "Caroline Ashton," Isabella began, her voice devoid of heat but sharp as obsidian, "your behavior today has been more than unprofessional. It has been disgraceful." Caroline opened her mouth, perhaps to offer another panicked excuse, but Isabella held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "You did not know who I was," Isabella continued, her words precise, cutting through the silence, "and that is the crux of the issue. You didn't know, because you didn't bother to grant me the basic human respect automatically afforded to others on this flight. You judged me, you acted on prejudice, you escalated a situation with hostility, and ultimately, violence." She paused, letting the indictment hang in the air. "You have humiliated yourself, you have violated the trust placed in you by this airline, and you have tarnished the reputation Sinclair Airlines strives to uphold. A reputation built on service, integrity, and respect for all individuals." Caroline's face crumpled. Tears began to well in her eyes, born perhaps less of remorse and more of sheer terror. "Miss Sinclair, please. Your actions today," Isabella stated, overriding the stammered plea with cold finality, "have proven you unfit for duty with Sinclair Airlines. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." The words hit Caroline like another physical blow. A sob escaped her lips. At that precise moment, two uniformed police officers appeared at the top of the aircraft stairs, their presence immediately commanding attention. They conferred briefly with Michael, Isabella's assistant, who gestured discreetly towards Caroline. The officers then stepped fully into the cabin, their expressions professional and serious. One of the officers approached Isabella respectfully. "Miss Sinclair?" he inquired. "We received a report regarding an assault that occurred on this aircraft. Are you the complainant?" Isabella met his gaze directly. "I am," she confirmed. "And are you wishing to press charges against this individual?" he asked, nodding towards the now openly weeping Caroline. "Yes," Isabella replied firmly, without hesitation. "I am. This individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held fully accountable under the law." Caroline gasped, shaking her head violently. "No, wait, please," she cried, her voice desperate, cracking. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. You can't arrest me. I was just doing my job. She provoked me." The attempt at justification sounded pathetic, even to her own ears, dissolving into incoherent sobs as the second officer stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am," the first officer said formally, addressing Caroline, "you are under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer recited the Miranda rights, the reality crashed down upon Caroline. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. She sagged, all defiance gone, replaced by shuddering sobs of pure panic and despair. "Please, Miss Sinclair, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" Isabella watched her, her expression unreadable, impassive. "Your apology is meaningless without accountability, Ms. Ashton," she said quietly, her voice devoid of malice, but equally devoid of pity. "You made your choices. Now you face the consequences." Firmly but professionally, the two officers escorted the handcuffed, weeping Caroline Ashton down the aisle. Passengers shifted awkwardly to let them pass, their faces a mixture of pity, contempt, and relief. The click of Caroline's heels on the cabin floor sounded unnaturally loud, a final jarring punctuation mark to her career and her freedom. The main door hissed shut behind them, severing Caroline Ashton from the world she had so confidently inhabited just hours before. A heavy silence descended once more. The immediate threat was gone. Justice had been set in motion. Isabella Sinclair stood tall, watching the door close, the faint red mark on her cheek a visible testament to the ordeal. Then she turned slowly to face the remaining passengers and crew inside her aircraft. The heavy click of the aircraft door sealing shut echoed in the suddenly vast silence of the cabin. Caroline Ashton was gone, escorted away to face the legal consequences of her actions. The immediate storm had passed, leaving behind a strange calm, thick with unspoken thoughts and the residue of shock. Passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes initially, then slowly beginning to exchange looks, relief, lingering disbelief, perhaps a touch of shame from those who had silently judged. Isabella Sinclair took a moment, drawing a slow, steadying breath. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep weariness, but also a cold, clear sense of purpose. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the remaining passengers and crew. The red mark on her cheek was a visible reminder of the ugliness that had transpired, but her eyes held only calm resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, easily filling the quiet cabin. "First, please allow me to offer my sincerest apologies for the unacceptable events you were forced to witness today." She paused, letting her sincerity resonate. What occurred here was a gross violation of the standards of service, respect, and basic human decency that Sinclair Airlines stands for. It is not indicative of the values we strive to uphold, nor of the professionalism I expect from every single member of my team. Nods of understanding and agreement rippled through the passengers. Mr. Raymond gave a distinct grunt of approval. David Miller simply watched her, his expression conveying respect. "We will, of course, ensure you reach your intended destinations with minimal further delay," Isabella continued. "But more importantly, I want to assure you that this incident will be addressed thoroughly at an organizational level to ensure nothing like it ever happens again on any of our flights." Her gaze then moved, seeking out the pale but composed figure of Hannah Evans, who still stood near the galley. "Hannah," Isabella called softly. Hannah started, surprised to be addressed directly. She stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes wide. "Hannah," Isabella repeated, a hint of warmth entering her tone for the first time. "Throughout this situation, I observed your conduct, your professionalism under duress, your clear discomfort with Ms. Ashton's behavior, and," she added, her eyes holding Hannah's, conveying an understanding that went beyond words, "your integrity. It did not go unnoticed." She smiled faintly. "Sinclair Airlines needs people like you, people who understand that respect isn't optional, it's fundamental. You'll be hearing from my executive office regarding a significant commendation and promotion." "Thank you, Hannah." Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. "The thank you, Miss Sinclair," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Isabella gave her a reassuring nod before turning back to her assistants. Michael, Sarah, please coordinate with Captain Evans to ensure our passengers are rerouted or accommodated as needed upon arrival. Let's get underway. With quiet efficiency, the aircraft was soon prepared for departure again. The remainder of the flight proceeded in a subdued but significantly altered atmosphere. The service, now led by a senior attendant, quickly called in from the relief crew at the FBO and assisted by a grateful, newly confident Hannah, was impeccable, attentive, and uniformly respectful. In the days and weeks that followed, the story inevitably broke. Witness accounts, perhaps discreetly filmed phone footage, found their way online. The narrative of the billionaire airline owner, calmly enduring prejudice and assault before revealing her identity and ensuring swift justice, became a viral sensation. Hashtags like "I respect above all" and "Sinclair Vision" trended globally. Caroline Ashton's name became synonymous with entitled prejudice, her fall from grace dissected endlessly online and in the press as her legal troubles mounted. Isabella, usually intensely private, addressed the situation publicly, not to relish a victory, but to reinforce a principle. In a widely circulated televised interview, seated not in opulent surroundings, but a simple professional studio, she spoke directly and powerfully. The luxury of Sinclair Airlines isn't defined by the leather seats or the champagne, she stated, her gaze steady, meeting the camera directly. It's defined by the experience we create, an experience built on a foundation of absolute respect for every individual who steps aboard our aircraft. Respect is a right, not a privilege earned by wealth, status, or appearance. The interviewer leaned forward. Many are calling you a hero, Miss Sinclair. How do you respond to that? Isabella's expression softened slightly. I don't see myself as a hero. I see myself as someone who refused to accept blatant disrespect. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply holding your ground, knowing your worth even when others try to diminish it. True leadership, she added, her voice regaining its firmness, is about setting the standard for that respect and ensuring it's upheld, consistently and without exception. True to her word, sweeping changes were implemented across Sinclair Airlines. Training programs were overhauled, incorporating rigorous modules on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. Conduct policies were reinforced with zero-tolerance clauses for discrimination or harassment. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened, empowering crew members like Hannah Evans to speak up without fear of retribution. Isabella didn't just make a statement, she rebuilt the framework. Weeks later, Isabella Sinclair boarded another Sinclair Airlines flight, this one a standard transatlantic crossing. She settled into her seat, acknowledging the warm professional greeting from the flight crew, led as it happened by a composed and smiling Hannah Evans, now wearing the insignia of a lead attendant. The cabin atmosphere felt different, lighter, more relaxed, yet underscored by a quiet current of genuine respect. As the plane climbed through the clouds, bathed in the soft light of dawn, Isabella looked out the window. The memory of that day, the sting of the slap, the ugliness of the prejudice, hadn't faded entirely. It likely never would. It was a scar, a reminder of the insidious nature of bias that could fester even in the most privileged environments. Confronting it had been necessary, not just for her own dignity, but for the message it sent. She thought of Caroline Ashton facing the ruins of her career and reputation, a stark lesson in accountability. She thought of Hannah Evans, rewarded for her integrity. She thought of the policies now in place, ripples spreading outward from that single ugly incident. Turning a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change hadn't been easy. It required a resolve she hadn't known she possessed until tested. But as she gazed out at the endless horizon, a sense of quiet triumph settled over her. Not a triumph over one ignorant individual, but the triumph of principle. The journey towards truly universal respect was long, she knew. It required constant vigilance, continued action. But looking out at the vast expanse, heading towards her next challenge, Isabella Sinclair felt a renewed sense of peace, mingled with unwavering determination. The work had begun, and she was ready. The sky, after all, was hers. And so Isabella Sinclair's turbulent journey on that flight reaches its destination, leaving behind the echoes of a confrontation that was about so much more than just a seat or a spilled drink. It was a stark reminder that dignity isn't earned by status or appearance, but demanded by our shared humanity. We witnessed the destructive power of prejudice, embodied by Caroline Ashton, but also the quiet, unshakable strength of resolve in Isabella. Her story shows us that true power isn't just about wealth or ownership. It's about wielding influence with integrity, demanding accountability, and using even painful moments as catalysts for meaningful change. Like the new standards set at Sinclair Airlines, and the recognition given to Hannah Evans for her courage. One person's refusal to accept disrespect truly did spark a ripple effect. It leaves us wondering, doesn't it? How often do we encounter subtle or not so subtle biases in our own lives? How can we each contribute to making respect the unwavering standard, not the exception? We hope this story resonated with you as much as it did with us during its creation. If you were moved, angered, inspired, or simply captivated by Isabella's journey and the pursuit of justice, please give this video a like. It truly helps support the channel. Share this story with others who might appreciate its message. And most importantly, we want to hear from you in the comments below. What were your thoughts and feelings as the story unfolded? What lessons or messages stood out most to you? Do you have any feedback or suggestions for us? We're always looking for ways to improve our storytelling and bring you content you love, so your input is incredibly valuable. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey today. We appreciate your time and support more than words can say. Until next time, take care and treat each other with kindness.